Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Almost nothing. Well, next to nothing, yeah.
So the picture.
Yeah.
Here are the ones that I got when I first. There's a story there. Not for my stream. Okay. I'm going to. Good to go. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Father Dan, and I'm here with my buddy David Wickenden.
Hey.
And we are going to begin this evening going through the Catechism of the Anglican Church, which we've been doing for a little over 18 months or so now. And so if you've ever seen this podcast, we've been going for about 2 years now and going through a variety of different topics as a community. This is the Good Samaritan Anglican Church podcast, by the way. But we've dedicated the past few months to going over the Anglican Catechism. And specifically right now, we're using this catechism that was developed by the Anglican Church in North America called To Be a Christian. And we are presently working our way through the Apostles' Creed. And we're right now on page 36. You can find a little PDF of the document right there on the links on the live stream. And we're going to pick up at page 36 with the statement, creator of heaven and earth. And we've been doing this for a couple weeks now, going through the creeds, going through the Apostles' Creed, rather. And the whole point of, I guess, what we're trying to do is try to lay a groundwork and a framework for the rationale that undergirds Christian discipleship. Yeah. And so I think that's a good starting point.
Yep.
The questions that we're going to be covering today, questions 42, 43, and 44, are why do you call God the Father Creator? Question 43, how does recognizing God as Creator inform your understanding of His creation? And question 44, what does it mean that God created both heaven and earth? All right, so there's a good sort of jumping off point. Do you have any further preamble before we just dive into it?
I think we're good to go. Oops.
So awesome that you don't have to say things all the time. I wish I was like that. All right. So would you read and answer question 42?
I will. 42. Why do you call God the Father Creator? I call God the Father Creator because He made all things. He creates and sustains all things through His Word and gives life to all creatures through His Spirit. And the scriptural passages are Genesis 1 through 2. Let's try that again. Genesis 1 through 2, 3, and 7. Psalm 104, 24 to 30. John 1 through 3. Acts 17, 24 to 28, and Colossians 1, 16 through 18.
And I just wrote down that awesome quotation that Paul gives while he's standing on the Acropolis. I'm just going to read briefly here from Acts chapter 17, verses 24 through 28. This is Paul speaking, the God who made the world and everything in it, He who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is He served by human hands, as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor He made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and He allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for Him and find Him, though indeed He is not far from each one of us, for in Him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, we too are his offspring. Okay. So, a lot of people, I think it would be easy to think that the word creator is somehow a repeat or a reiteration of the word father. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important that we distinguish here the concept of God being creator from God being the father.
Yes, because I think there are two concepts of creation. Yeah. There's the one we can do, and being a biological father is one, but making a chair would be a creator. Yeah. So that there is somebody who takes something that's already pre-existing and turns it into something else. Yeah. So that's one type of creation, but that's not what the Bible is talking about.
Right.
I mean, it is talking about it because there are acts of creation by humans within and by God within the Bible. Yeah. But God is creator in a different way as well. He created, the Latin is ex nihilo, from nothing.
Yeah.
And nothing isn't something. So, so he didn't just take what already existed and fashion it into something, with logic and meaning and function. He was one step behind that. He took where there was no thing and made something, and then through either his either I'm not being ambiguous, both through his direct action and also by the laws of physics that he created, he then caused everything to be that is.
Yeah. So this I think this is a really important sort of starting point in our conversation, because I think one of the really early mistakes we can make, though we claim to be theists, is to affirm or believe in a deistic God.
Yes.
And what I mean by this is, I hear people speak of God as the creator as if he is done with his creation.
Yes.
And I think it's just hugely problematic, because it speaks to this very issue that the answer to question 42 is bringing to. He creates and sustains all things by his word.
This is... the deism, and for those who don't know, deism was a theology in particularly the 17th and 18th centuries, which was based on the very mechanistic understanding that science was deriving of the universe. That basically, if you wound it up and let everything go, it would just run along smoothly. Because that's what the laws of physics require that it does. That planets orbit, and we know they orbit, and we can predict exactly, if given a couple of very simple mathematical equations, the mass of the sun, the distance of the object orbiting the sun, and the mass of that object, how fast it has to be going to stay in orbit. If it goes slower than that, it will spiral into the sun. If it goes faster than that, it will spiral away from the sun. That's a very simple mathematical formula. It's like 5 or 6 characters total.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of what they were working with, because that's what it appeared in the 17th and 18th century, what the universe ran like. And if everything can be predicted from its prior condition, then what need is there to have God in this picture? Because once the planets are going, there's nothing to stop them going. Once the nuclear fusion in the sun starts, and they didn't know anything about nuclear fusion, it will keep going. It's a self-sustaining process. So this idea of deism, that God lit the blue touch paper, retired, and is now off playing golf or whatever it is he's doing, it actually fit in with the physics of a certain era in human discovery. The problem was the 19th century, and then the early 20th century suddenly showed the universe didn't work like that. And the Bible anticipates that the world is not this mechanistic, deterministic process. There is much more to it than that. that.
Yeah. Well, I think that the way that we talk about God philosophically can sometimes create this problem too. One of the common philosophical arguments for the concept of God is the idea of an uncaused cause, or an unmoved mover. Yeah. And the problem I think that elicits is when we think of cause, we think of it in a very simplistic way, cause and effect. Yes. And what we're living in now is the effect of that simplistic cause. Yes. When as a point of fact, I think, at least from my framework, where I'm at presently in this theological place, is that everything that's going on in terms of God's work in the world, God's instrumentation in the church, the work of the Holy Spirit in the life, that is an ongoing work of creation. Yes. I just finished reading the healing narratives in the Gospels for a side project, not immediately church related, that I was doing. Is one thing that really hit home to me, especially in some passages in Mark or in Matthew, is that Jesus seems to be communicating to us that he's continuing the prior work of creation that he started. And that actually, in a more formulaic way, I sort of see this in a way as what sin and reconciliation are, what life in the Spirit is, what communion is it's all that calling of God to be a new creation while we continue to engage in sort of anti-creative activity, sin, something like that. Or anyway, so those are some reflections I go on that. Well, so let me just ask one more thing about this. I'm sorry, I could just talk about this all day. So when we see the word here, sustains all things through his word, could you unpack that phrase a little bit for us?
Yes. Yeah, okay. And let's start with the fact that in the Catechism, the word is capitalized. It's a proper name. Yeah. And of course, this relates directly to John 1:1. Yeah. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Yeah. And he then later on identifies the Word as Jesus. Yeah. So we have this story this description in John 1 that not only that God is the creator, but he created through his Son, through the Word. So it's almost like there's a not two-step process, but the Word is, if you like, where the interaction between God and the world takes place. It's in some sense that it's not that God is removed from that because Jesus himself is God, but it's that the Father is in some sense removed from that process. Okay. Trying to avoid any Gnostic
or modalist tendencies.
Yes. Not Gnosticism is what came to my mind. It's not that God cannot interact with the world, because he can. It's that God chooses, if you like, to act through his Son, in the same way that, in a different way, he acts through the Holy Spirit. Yeah. The Father acts through that, it's not God. This is, not only is the world created back in Genesis 1,
only 4,000 years ago.
Only 4,000 or 6,000 or 10,000 or 50,000, whatever your current number is.
That was sarcasm, by the way,
yes,
guys. Okay,
I think we're both on the old Earth end of things. But it's not enough that the world is started. The world has to be sustained as it continues to play out this plan of God's. So it's that the world from one second to the next doesn't need to continue to exist. God chooses to allow it to continue to exist and sustains it in that existence.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like we've sufficiently addressed the question itself. I like the idea of just jumping off on a few maybe higher level theological points on this. I have very hesitantly been starting to let go of a sort of Neoplatonic conception of human beings. Okay. And I guess this is one of my biggest, if I have a big differentiation between my way of reflecting on the concept of a creaturely goodness for a human being and what I think a Thomistic conception of this is the idea of us being born with an eternal soul.
Okay.
I'm much more inclined in my present state of mind to think that our soul is something that is sustained and only maintained by the fruit of the tree, or the ongoing nurturance of God. God alone is holy. God alone is immortal, and it's only by Him that we live and move and have our being. I wonder if you fall into that conversation. It's like the Hebrew versus the Greek mindset.
Right. I think, like most people raised in the West, I have this a Platonic separation between the physical and the spiritual, whatever it is. What has driven me to some degree away from that is the incredibly close relationship between the brain and the mind. There's a huge philosophical debate. Modern science has no explanation for the mind. The experience that I have.
Yes.
Because that is not a physical thing. So how does the physical thing, my brain, produce that non-physical experience? But at the same time, if you damage my brain, you will damage that experience. So there is clearly a very, very intimate relationship between those two things. And I'm not sure anymore that I understand what it means to be outside of my body. My wife claims to have had, and I have no reason to doubt her, an out-of-body experience. So
I got to talk to her about that soon.
So apparently it is possible. It's just I'm not really sure what that means, but I suspect that is the soul, whatever the soul is. But I'm not convinced how long it can be removed from the body. And that experience, that whatever that I am is to continue, because we're not just talking about the experience, but my continued existence through time. That how is the David of today in some way the same David of 50 something years ago when I was before I turned 10. There's clearly no physical link. Every cell in my body has been replaced multiple times. Some have not been replaced.
Talking about the skin cells on your head.
Yes, that's right.
I'm with you.
And some have been added to it. But the whole point is that I'm the only one who has those memories of a 6-year-old David.
You're right.
And I'm the only one who can have those memories because I'm the only one who was present for absolutely every single one of those experiences. But at the same time, I've been asleep, thousands of times between now and then. I've had surgery on one occasion, so I was, not just unconscious, but induced unconscious. There's a sense in which I am continuous to that person, that 6-year-old, because you can follow. If you were boring, you can follow. You could hang around and follow me all the way through. This body, even though it keeps changing, has got this one long continuous experience. My mind has got that one long continuous experience punctuated by a whole bunch of sleep. So in what sense am I the David? I'm obviously not the David that I was when I was 6.
Right.
And yet there is something of that David still in me. And so I have moved. I'm really, I kind of like you. I've moved away from this Platonic idea that there's a real David out there somewhere that got shoved into a body. You can't take the body away from David, at least not long term. But at the same time, there is clearly something that's not physical. There's more than simply the processes in my brain, the electrical and the chemical processes. There's something else that's creating the me. So I think, I'm not sure exactly, because I think I'm still wrestling with this issue of consciousness, because I think it is fundamental to what we are as beings. And obviously we share consciousness with a dog or a cat, and maybe some consciousness with a lizard, and maybe even a little bit with an insect. I don't know, but whatever consciousness is a large chunk of what defines me. And I can certainly see why, at least theoretically, that consciousness can be removed from my body. But at the same time, I don't think it can be removed permanently. And I would argue that because of, if you damage my brain, you will damage my mind.
Right. Yeah.
And that consciousness. And people can be blind, but they're still conscious. So it's not necessarily the inputs that make you conscious.
Yeah.
It's much more complicated than that.
Well, I think this has become a real big issue recently. One of my friends told me the other day that he believes the central crisis within the Western world is the concept of anthropology. Mm-hmm. That because we have a very ill-defined conception of what it means to be human,
yes,
or what it means to be a person, that we as Christians are struggling with Christian anthropology,
yes,
how to sort of understand what embodiment is, especially in an internet culture.
Yes.
I mean, amongst many other things going on in society.
Yes. Could you download my consciousness to a computer?
Yeah.
If it was a sufficiently complex computer, is it simply a matter of computational power?
Yeah.
I don't think it is. I remember one of my philosophy professors saying he did not believe that we would ever have artificial consciousness because he couldn't conceive of the concept of a computer waiting for somebody.
Yeah.
Know?
Oh, yeah.
There is something animals, at least cats and dogs, higher level animals, wait. I mean, they understand what it means that dogs do, I'm not sure about cats. But a dog does wait for somebody. Waits for you to come home.
Yeah.
So they have some concepts there that we share with them. What does that mean? What is it about that is embodied in a body? Because clearly, logically, I can imagine a disembodied mind waiting.
Sure.
If it's still in time, it can wait.
Yeah.
But it's not. Yeah, I don't know. And ultimately, it's embodiment is yes. What is this again? Descartes famously tried to locate the interface between the mind and the body in the pineal gland, as I recall.
Right. I think that's right. Yeah.
Which has obviously been laughed at. But the trouble is that I think, if you like, secular brain scientists and psychology haven't got a better answer, haven't got a less frivolous answer, quite honestly.
Yeah.
At least Descartes was working with very basic medicine. He didn't have an excuse for getting it. Well, he did have an excuse for getting it wrong, which modern people shouldn't.
Have that solved yet?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you think is noteworthy to say about 42 right there?
No, I think we've gone off especially off tangent.
Fair enough. All right. I'm going to read 43. How does recognizing God as creator inform your understanding of his creation? Answer. I acknowledge that God created for his own glory everything that exists. He created human beings, male and female, in his image, and appointed us stewards of creation. God's creation is thus a gift to enjoy as we work and care for it. The references here are Genesis 1, 27 and 28, Psalm 8, verses 5 through 8, Luke 19, 11 through 27, and 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. And I just included this Genesis chapter passage and this Psalm passage as well. Would you mind reading those for me, David?
Genesis 1. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." And then Psalm 8. Yet you have made them a little lower than God, and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet.
And it just goes on to list all the different types of types of creatures. So I think that this is really crucial in answering our previous question which is part and parcel to being a creature, is understanding that our created order has a purposing, namely the concept of being an image bearer.
Yes.
So anyway, there's lots of ways that we can talk about this, but maybe should we, let me ask you this. What does this mean when we say that God created us in his image?
Well, obviously not physically. Because
God's not physical.
No, it's not physical. I'm not sure we've discussed it here, but we have discussed it in other places. If Genesis 1, God creates everything physical. Obviously, he doesn't create himself, but he creates everything that is now existing except for himself. That means he creates all of matter and space and time.
Right.
So whatever image means, it cannot mean he looks anything like us.
Sure.
Because he not only doesn't he have that physical existence, he's never had that physical existence. So whatever that image is, it's not a physical image. It's a psychological image, a nature image. It's the fundamental things of what it means to be human are not all of God's nature, but they are the important parts to create beings that can interact with him and relate to him and have free will, which is kind of important in the grand scheme of things.
So let me just ask for a little clarity in the last little part there. So are you saying that our conception or us having free will is in some sense a reflection of who God is?
I actually think we probably have more free will than God.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Yeah,
it's not that. I mean, God had the choice of creation or no creation. I don't think there was ever any force that could be applied to God to make him create.
Yeah,
even if there was something else out there that could enforce God to act. So I'm not denying that God has free will, but I think by virtue of being perfectly holy, he is limited in what he can act and retain that perfection. So we have very basically, we have the choice to sin or not to sin.
Right.
Or at least in theory, we have the choice to sin or not to sin. We seem to ignore the choice a great deal and just go straight to the sinning. But God doesn't have that choice.
Right.
God has to act always within line with his nature, and his nature in a lot of ways is more constrained than ours is, because although we will always act within our nature allows us to choose two paths at any one time. So I do think free will is absolutely critical to this whole discussion.
Yeah.
And God gave us attributes, shares with us attributes of his nature. One of which, as I say, is free will, but I think it's ours is broader than his in some ways. He then allows us to choose what we're going to do with that nature.
Yeah. So, using the word nature here, I think this is useful. The way that it is placed here, at least in terms of the answer in this, in question 43, God's creation is a gift to enjoy as we work and care for it. And what I see in that framework is that we are doing not only the concept of work,
yes,
not only the concept of care, which is separate, I think, from work, but also that there's enjoyment in that framework also.
Yes, and I think we see that different people enjoy different aspects of that.
Sure.
My mother loves gardening.
Crazy.
Yes,
that's crazy.
I'm sorry. First of all, I managed to kill most of the things I look at, let alone actually try to do anything with. But that she enjoys that, and she enjoys making the world more beautiful by how she arranges plants and flowers and trees. Is caring for the world. Yeah. How we deal with the climate crisis we're dealing with right now will say a lot a great deal about what humanity as a whole thinks about this creation. That we have architects who can design the most stunning buildings that absolutely complement the location where they're placed, or if any of the architects from the 50s and 60s have a great deal to answer for, because they seem to be determined to make the world as ugly as possible. Yeah. But that's another story. But artists who can create fabulous works of beautiful works of art, farmers taking care of fields and land and allowing wildlife don't just extract every dollar worth of value out of the land, but allow nature to coexist with it, because that's what's needed to create a more beautiful, productive, a world that God has created it for us to do. It's simply, caring for the world is not simply just making sure extinct animals or nearly extinct animals don't become extinct, though that is part of caring for it. But it's making sure that everything can have its place in this creation, in the way God intended for it to have a place in the creation.
And to me, that really speaks a lot to my own, I think, what I perceive to be one of the biggest issues in my life when it comes to the concept of sin, which is, at least in the way that I'm thinking about it nowadays, sin is almost always, in my frame of reference, when I start treating myself or someone else in a way that I ought to be treating God.
Yes.
Or maybe sort of a disordering of my creaturely relationship with God. And so to me, this is part of the problem is both there's an issue with the work, there's an issue with my lack of care, and there's also an issue with the concept of enjoyment.
Yes.
And I really think that all three of those are huge. And I'm saying all this to say, I had a revelation today. I picked up my 6-month-old, almost 6-month-old baby from school. He's the only one that hasn't disappointed me yet of the 5 kids. Which is not related to his age, by the way, or may not be.
You're putting an awful lot of pressure on
exactly. He'll be perfect in every way. And I was holding him, and I had this sort of moment. I don't know if it was God or it was me, where I realized that something that was him, as he just took a moment to not be busy and just be with me, his being present with me did something to me. And I don't know what it was. Right. I didn't really know how to articulate it. I'm sure some neuroscientists could use a lot of good chemical names to describe what's going on with me. But I wonder about this in terms of our creaturely nature in relationship to God. That if we were created to glorify God, let's take out the idea of this being a church service, right?
Yep.
But let's look at this at the idea of a father holding his 6-month-old in his arms. That to me is more under the pattern of being in the image of God, is somehow we're sharing with him something that's between us. Yes. That he wants us to have and share in. Right. That we also want to reflect back and be present with him.
Yes, I think that's a great analogy, because this does talk about our being for the glory of God.
Yeah.
Well, the ultimate being already has all the glory he can need, whatever that means. So our job is to reflect that glory back to him, if you like. He gives it to us, and it is our job to reflect it back to him, because that's where our focus should be. If we are taking that glory, and probably my analogy or metaphor is breaking down at this point, and start directing it in other directions, that's not what it's for. It's we're sounding Aristotelian here, but it's things are created for a purpose. They have a telos, and we are created to reflect God's glory.
Yeah,
that is, and when we sin, generally, That's the last thing we're doing.
Right.
You're talking about it. It's disordered. Yes, it's like a mirror that's not pointing in the right direction.
Yeah.
Wherever the image it's got it's sending it off somewhere where it isn't supposed to go. Or it's like Hubble was when it got launched, and it was just slightly out of focus because it was like 0.5 millimeter or something. They'd misground the lens. This is what's gone wrong. This is where the fall comes into play. It's not necessarily that they ate the apple or whatever the fruit was, or listened to the serpent. It's that they stopped reflecting God back to God, if you like, His glory back to God, and instead, the analogy really breaks down here, but now they're reflecting it onto the apple tree or onto the serpent or onto themselves or each other. It's just simply that they've gone off base, or they walkabout, to use Australian term.
Okay, so this takes us a little bit further afield, but what would it look like for us as creatures, especially who live in the 21st century, who I think are in so many ways disconnected from the concept of embodiment or work or care in a sort of creaturely sense, much less the concept of enjoyment. Yeah. How would we fall back into line as image bearers with that conversation?
Well, I think a good place to always start is looking, how did Jesus image bear? Yeah. Because, as we've said before, Jesus is fully human and fully divine. Yeah. He is not only reflecting the Father back to the Father, but he is himself God, and therefore is projecting that divinity. So, being image bearers means acting as God acts, or would act in a particular situation if he were embodied, if he were Jesus. And sort of classically throughout the New Testament, we see that means putting yourself second. Yeah. Putting the needs of others ahead of yours, no matter how much it hurts you. Yeah. Because I think, we sort of say that first part of that sentence, and that sounds very pious and holy, but then we have to look at what did it cost Jesus. Yeah. And the answer is the cross. Yeah. It wasn't simply that he was embodied for 30-something years, but in the end he was, at least for a period of time, separated from the Father. Yeah. I mean, this is a huge cost, sort of cost we can never pay. Yeah. So I do think that, to whatever it means to be image bearers of God, is in some ways look like Jesus. Now, obviously, we are not called to a first century back end of beyond in the Roman Empire. We are 21st century in America or wherever the people who are watching this are. And the specifics of what that looks like are unique to us. Yeah. The principle is universal. Right. And this is where, and I think I've heard this, a couple of different analogies, but I think they're both good. One is the reason police and army and anybody with guns has to be trained how to fire the guns is because you have to be trained when you are under stress how to act with a gun. Wow. Because, they'll tell you that I have fired guns, but never in a situation where anybody's life was in danger or I was personally threatened. But they will tell you in a stress situation, people will hold the trigger pulled until the magazine is empty, even if they only meant to fire once. It's just a simple stress, and you have to be trained out of that. Yeah. So we have to be trained how to act in a situation. Yes, the Holy Spirit can, and probably in all of our lives at some point has empowered us to act in a particular way where we wouldn't naturally act that way. Yeah. But we also need to be able to do that for ourselves, because I think on occasion the Spirit isn't going to step in to help us out. Yeah. So that's one analogy. The other one is, and I assume this is true, I don't know, but when people at the Fed or banks are looking for fake or counterfeit money, they don't show them counterfeit money. They show them the real thing. They become so intimately familiar with the real thing that any kind of forgery sticks out a mile. We need to become so familiar with God and how he acts, how Jesus acts in that situation, that we just for ourselves can figure out when it's not real, when we've gone off the rails, when it's a forgery, if you like, because it won't feel right. We don't need to be able to say, well, the ink is just the wrong shade of whatever. It's just wrong. Whatever it is, and I can't. And we've all been in that situation with something where we say, I don't know what the problem is, but I know that's wrong. There is something there that's just not quite adding up, and I think we need to be in that situation that we are so familiar with God's calling and what it means to walk in that calling, that when we go wrong, it's really obvious to us without having to analyze everything and you know, because we may not have time to do that analysis.
It's really, really good. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on. Okay. Last question. Would you read this one for us? Question 44.
Question 44. What does it mean that God created both heaven and earth? Answer, it means that all things, whether visible or invisible, physical or spiritual, were brought into being out of nothing by the word of the eternal God. Genesis 1 through 8, Psalm 33, 6 through 8, John 1:3, and Colossians 1:16.
Thank you. And I'm just going to read these scripture references here. John chapter 1, verse 3, I added in verse 4 also. All things came into being through him, that is the Word, later identified as Jesus. And without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him, or by him really, was life. And the life was the light of all people. And then additionally, Psalm 33, verses 6 through 8. By the word of the Lord, the heavens and the heavens were made, and all their host by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea as in a bottle, and he put the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. Okay. So I think that this is useful and a thing that we can't set aside because, man, I remember 8th grade science class, man. I don't know if you had this experience too, but one of the kids in one of the other science classes was making a big stink about evolution and Big Bang Theory and all these. And I understand these are controversial subjects, and the way that both Christians and scientists have handled these things has been, I should say, Christians who are not scientists and scientists who are not Christians have dealt with these questions has been hugely problematic. But one of the things that one of my science teachers made the statement of, I still remember it, it was not 8th grade, it was 10th grade, was that the focus and the purpose of religion is spirituality. Mm-hmm. That the purpose and focus of science is the physical world, or that which can be empirically determined. And I think there's a degree to which that statement it's the beginnings of an elementary truth in that.
Yeah, I think I agree with the second statement. Yeah. Science has it's a large, but it's a limited remit.
Right.
If you can't do an experiment on it and make a projection, it's not science.
Right.
Whatever it is this is where things like string theory, it sits right on the very outer edge of science, because there are so far no experiments that can be done to determine whether it's true or false. Yeah. There aren't any even predictions, because the range of predictions it comes up with is so broad is of no help. Same is true with quantum theory, that there are like 28 different ways of interpreting the mathematics of it. The most popular one is the Copenhagen interpretation, but there are 27 others, And there's no experiment that can be done to determine which one is actually, if any of them, is actually true. And I'm not denying that, quantum physics has been tested incredibly deeply and has been shown to be true, and it's really, really weird. But that's another story too.
Right.
But the point is that they're butting up against the limits, not simply the limits of our human knowledge at this time, but the limits of what the laws of physics will allow us to actually learn. It's rather like the shortest measurable distance and the shortest measurable period of time are not necessarily the bottom scale. It's not possible to measure either a shorter period of time, and it's like 10 to the minus 43 of a second. It's a very, very brief period of time, and the distance is 10 to the minus 26 of a centimeter or something like that. It's incredibly, but those two are actually related to each other. But the problem is you actually have this gets really weird. The shorter the distance or the shorter the period of time you want to measure, the more energy you have to put into the experiment to do it, and at some point you create a black hole because E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times speed of light squared. If the more energy you put in, the more mass you get. And so at some point you reach a point where you can't get out because that's what happens when you get
create an event horizon.
Yes, you create an event horizon, and we actually cannot see beyond that. And so anyway, so the point is that there is a sense in which science does deal with the empirical. It can only, that's almost the definition of science. It has to be empirical. Well, that leaves out beauty. That leaves out justice. That leaves out meaning. And it leaves out the spiritual.
Well,
yes.
I think most profoundly, and maybe the most sort of comically, it leaves out the very truth that science seeks to discover.
Yes.
Because the claim that there is such a thing as truth is a philosophical.
Yes, it's not a scientific claim.
Yeah.
You can't do an experiment to prove that something is true.
Right.
It's ontological.
Right.
It's not empirical. Yes.
Yeah, or any way that truth would be applied.
Yes.
Would also be a philosophical framework. Not to mention, Anna Kaluthon, not to mention this thing I'm mentioning. In addition to that, most of the time these professors who are the ones who are saying you can't determine a scientific truth without using empirical scientific data have degrees in their degrees. It's doctorates of philosophy.
Yes.
Which is,
that's what PhD stands for. Yeah.
Right. Which is anyway. But I think this is it speaks to both the poverty of the willingness of science to be self-reflective, but I want to say the exact same problem is the case for religion.
Yes.
That I know so many. I preached this in my very short 46-minute long sermon yesterday. That one of the things I find is one of my biggest frustrations with American Christianity, at least my experience of Christianity in the West, I'm not saying it's the universal expression of it, is a Christianity that is devoid of empirical evidence that it makes a difference.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Why did Christ die? Right. Was it so that we could wear funny clothes and have church services?
No.
God, no. No. It was so that we would have life and have it to the fullest, that there would be some sort of replicable, empirically verifiable change in creaturely goodness.
Yes.
Or to the glory of God.
Yes.
To the glory of God.
Yep.
And I think this is where I find myself just at odds with many of my friends, is if we don't think of our religion or our spiritual practices as something that we can empirically verify or test, actually brings about some sort of shift, or we're able to discern truly what the will of God is in the work. We're wasting our time.
Right. We're just basically doing what we want to do.
Yeah.
And we comes back to that disordered attitude that we're all guilty of from time to time.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that's right. at times we're told not to test God, and at other times we're told to put him to the test. And I think we have to make sure we are following the appropriate instruction at the appropriate time.
Yeah.
Yes, jumping down off the tops of temples is probably not a good way to test God.
Just so we're clear, when we're told not to test God, what they mean by those passages is don't sin and hope that God will save you. When the passages say test God, it means follow his law and see if he actually keeps his promises.
Yes.
If he's actually a covenant
If
keeper.
he tells you to build a pile of logs, pour water over it, and he'll send fire down, great.
Go ahead.
If you are saying, I'm going to build a pyramid up to the sky to see if I can knock on heaven's door and get in,
Watch out.
Good. You're going to end up speaking some language you weren't aware of 5 minutes before.
Okay. I think that's useful as a sort of beginning point, but to me it also speaks to what I see as another side of this fallacy, which is that we need to first take care of all the material circumstances of a situation, and then when that's done, we'll take care of the spiritual circumstances of our situation.
Right.
I like to use this funny metaphor when I talk about the concept of the tithe, about my personal finances. Like, I make sure that my rent is paid first, and then after rent, all of the utilities, and after the utilities, my grocery bills, any extra for gasoline, fuel, car repair. But then at the end, I'll pay for the bourbon, right? And then once the bourbon's budget's all filled, then I'll give what's extra to the church, right? And what I think is really useful is how Jesus seems to flip all that on its head. But actually, the thing that is the most real is not the thing that you can touch. It's not the physical world. Right. The thing that actually has the true color, the true tangible aspects are all found in heaven.
Yes.
And if you start to figure this out, where you live first for heaven, and then you're able to let everything else go second to prioritizing heaven, what actually happens is you get to see the beauty of creation.
Yes.
It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's phrase about the Son. When I say that I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, I don't think it's I see everything else in the world because of I see him in everything else in the world, but in the same way that the Son reveals everything else. In the world.
I'm trying to think of the exact quote, but I can. It's not that I see the Son; it's I see everything lit
in light of the sun.
Lit by the sun or whatever.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that's right. It's very difficult because we live in this world. It's very difficult to put this world second. We're not very far here from a couple of freeways. If I try to walk across them, I'm not going to get very far.
Yeah.
I'm not a solipsist, obviously. But yes, that's right. It's incredible, and I think science. We've monetized people. We no longer see people as people. We see them as an economic activity.
Commodities.
We no longer see people as people. We see them as a bag of chemicals and with assorted physical and psychological ailments, some of which can be healed, some of which can't. But we don't see them as people who are hurting. We don't see them people who have addictions, who have physical infirmities that are controlling their lives in some cases.
And all that framework is pre-internet. You've just talked about people in terms of their shells. As soon as you throw a computer on there are a series of usernames or electronic data that's held on some storage site that we'll never see. Or touch.
Google is suggesting things based on. I've actually had this experience more than once. I have looked at a Google search at work for something on my work account, and they have that tied into my personal Google account.
Really?
So I'm getting suggestions, and this isn't anything very dramatically, but other than I looked up an address because I was interested. Well, we were doing some work on a particular property.
Yeah.
Suddenly, when I get to go in the car to come home, my GPS, which is powered by Google, says, "Do you want to go to that address?"
Yeah.
No, I don't. But why have you why are you even suggesting it?
Oh, yeah.
Obviously there's an algorithm that says it should be.
It's time for you to want something.
Yes,
like that.
exactly. Yes. So, yes, you're right that yes, pre-internet is, and I'm old enough that pre-internet is still the majority of my life.
Yep. Sure. Oh, wow. Majority. Wow, that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, because the internet sort of comes along in the early
Whenever
90s.
Al Gore invented it. Yeah.
That's right,
exactly.
yes. And, no, well, I guess I'm at the point right now it's about 50-50.
But halfway, yeah.
But obviously it's influenced our lives in ways we couldn't have imagined.
Oh, goodness.
When it came along, for good and for ill.
Oh, yeah.
But, yeah, so, yes, there's this whole pre-internet concept of what it means to be human, and that's been digitized, basically, and analyzed in ways that most of us don't even begin to understand.
Yeah.
And again, not just necessarily for ill, always, but so what it means to be human, we miss because we're so focused in on what this world is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's just talk about this briefly, because it's the second time we've seen this phrase, things were brought into being out of nothing. Mm-hmm. We had this conversation in Bible study a couple months ago. I think it's really important that we emphasize this is essential to Christian theology. Within the Christian framework, we as Christians don't really have an option. It's really essential to the concept of Christian theology that God created creation out of nothing.
Yes.
Why is that a really important starting point?
Because if God had simply taken what was already existing and molded it, which is what most religions in some form teach, certainly the non-Abrahamic religions teach.
Yeah, even Semitic ones,
Yes. There is something that ultimately doesn't answer to God, that at best God is equal to, but he is not superior. Either that pre-existing stuff always existed, in which case all God can do is mess with it. He can't take it out of existence. Or else it's in some sense his equal. So yes, this concept that God, by an act of will, creates everything that now exists, is fundamental to his nature. It's because part of what defines what God is he answers to nothing, and that includes whatever is created. This is why even, I think in the end, ideas like numbers and colours and logic are part of God's nature as well, because God cannot. If numbers exist without God, then numbers themselves have some sort of reality that God isn't responsible for.
Right.
So even intangible concepts have to ultimately find their cause in God himself. Now, let me just make one small point. Aquinas argued that Aquinas argued that the universe could be infinite in the past.
Sure. Best science of the time was...
Yes. He says he doesn't accept that because of the Bible.
Yeah.
But he actually didn't see a problem with a universe that was infinite in the past but was still contingent on God. That is...
Causally contingent.
Causally, yes. That the universe still exists even though it's infinitely in the past, and presumably infinite into the future as well. Because it still only exists because God wills it to exist. It's just now he hasn't willed a starting point. It's always existed. So if Aquinas is comfortable with that, I'll live with that, because who am I to question?
Well, to me, the only thing that would make sense, if I'm pretty sure Aquinas conceives of God as atemporal.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely, yes.
And then thereby the concept of God being a cause, as a timeless cause, is a completely reasonable...
Yes, because as a matter of logic, you cannot cross an infinite amount of time by addition. That is, by 1 second, by next second. No matter how much time you've crossed, you're still an infinitely far you're at an infinite distance from a finite point somewhere in the future. And this is the problem with if time is infinite in the past, we couldn't be it today.
Right.
Because we would have to cross, or the universe would have to cross an infinite amount of time, and it cannot do by successive addition. The only way you can do that is for all of the time to exist all at once.
Right.
And that's a subject for another day. Yeah. So, yes, I agree. I think Aquinas clearly saw God as outside of time. In fact, I think until the 19th century, you don't find anybody really suggesting that God is in time. That's really a 19th century. I'm not saying there was nobody before that. But,
okay.
But
sure.
Basically, I think the vast majority of theologians would have held that God was outside of time. The God in time only starts to get traction in the 19th century.
Okay. I'm not going to ask any more questions about that because I really want to talk about that. Okay, so useful that we understand that God brought everything into being out of nothing.
Yes.
I think that it might be important for us to bring up a physics problem.
Okay.
In this framework. I learned, at least when I was in high school, that that Newton had one of these laws that matter cannot be created or destroyed. How do we, if we're people who are going to try to affirm both the concept of...
Yeah, actually, it was energy that can neither be created or destroyed. It only changes form. Again, coming back to E equals mc squared.
Energy could not be created or destroyed.
The energy is stored, basically, if you like, and I always use this phrase, I've never heard anybody else use it, matter is congealed energy.
Yeah.
It's energy cooled down enough that it doesn't bounce around and ping off of things. So, because, and if you think about it, when the sun is burning, sun doesn't burn. It actually crushes hydrogen atoms and creates helium atom out of them. And for every, you crush together two hydrogen atoms, it's a more complicated process than this, but you crush together two hydrogen atoms and you get a helium atom. But a helium atom is not quite as heavy as two hydrogen atoms. And the difference is given off as energy. And is it 5 million tons a second the sun's going through? Something like that. It's some incredible number of how much of that tiny difference between the mass of one hydrogen or two hydrogen atoms and one helium atom. That's how much energy is being created or released. It's not really created in the sun. It's released. It changes from the form of a physical matter to energy. And then it works its way all the way out of the sun and eventually, rains down on us or misses us entirely and heads off into space. So, yes, and so how the question you asked is still a valid question. The answer is within the universe, energy can be neither created nor destroyed. There is a finite amount of energy in different forms. But to bring the universe into existence is not creating it within the universe. It is something outside the universe creating it. And so even the quantum vacuum, which is this idea that there is, even in a vacuum, there is energy, which is when quantum particles come into existence, they draw from the energy of the quantum vacuum, and then when they disappear again, they release that energy back into the quantum vacuum. That's what God ultimately created, is that energy. But yes, within the universe, all we can do is move energy around. We can break down, or in nuclear fusion, we can break down atomic nuclei, gives off energy. We can generate steam with that, which drives turbines. We can then store it again by either putting it into a battery, or we can pump water up a hill. And leave it in a lake up at the top of it, and then when we need it again, we can release it. So we can store energy, and thereby pumping the water up the hill, we've actually used gravity now to. We worked against gravity to get the water up there, and we work with gravity then to get to regenerate the electricity. So we're changing the form of the energy. We're not creating or destroying energy.
Got it.
And so it basically, in the first, and I can't remember how long it was, a couple of 100,000 years, the universe was so energetic that the subatomic particles couldn't form together, to clump together to create protons and neutrons, and but eventually, after about I think it's a couple of 100,000 years, electrons could exist. They weren't being bombarded with energy so much that they couldn't exist. And in fact, that's when light comes into existence.
Yeah.
And so that's the moment when it's called the cosmic dark ages ended. At least theoretically, when that happened is as far back as we could see in the universe. But we cannot see with visual light. We cannot go back behind that point because there was no visual light to see. But that's because the energy level in this, well, it wasn't that small, but in the universe was so high that
it didn't allow light to be emitted.
Right, exactly. Yes, yeah. So but it was still energy in a particular form. It was just in a different form to the ones we're now familiar with, and this is where the whole debate about dark energy and dark matter comes from. Is they come from something that they are. Storers of energy. Dark energy is a little bit different, but dark matter appears to be some sort of ordinary matter, except we have no idea what it is.
Yeah.
We can see its effect only through gravity, and occasionally through bending light. Sometimes the gravity causes light to be bent, and we have no idea. We know there must be something there to be causing the light to be bent, but we can't see it.
You're saying outside of an event horizon, this is the case?
Oh, this is way outside of an event. Yes, okay. This is
over the trajectory of space.
Yes, this is Einstein's cosmic lensing, which is when you send a light around a massive enough object, the actual direction of travel of the light will be altered
in a way that gravity doesn't account for.
No, gravity does. The point is that what we've got with dark matter is we can see the effect. We can't figure out what's causing the effects. Yes, it's like if you get it, the Earth and another galaxy or two galaxies lined up perfectly, you get what's called an Einstein cross, and that is you actually have four images of the most distant galaxy, one on each side of the galaxy in between the two of you, and we can even measure the effect. They predicted. There was an event in 1995, a supernova in a galaxy on the other side of another galaxy, and because the light is coming different distances on the four, they were actually able to point the Hubble telescope at that particular spot in the sky. To within a month, they knew the light should be arriving within a month, and they. Almost to the middle of the month they projected it.
Oh my goodness!
That's how precise the. And we never saw the original black. We never measured the first one arriving because we didn't have the equipment to do it. But they've actually measured. The other ones have all shown up exactly when they expected them to show up. It's one of the more remarkable things. And yeah, they actually pointed Hubble at this galaxy, or this point. It wouldn't even be the whole galaxy, but a point in the sky, and suddenly, bing! There is the there is the supernova. It's just most amazing thing.
Yeah.
Yes. Because one supernova occurs in a galaxy on average every 100 years or something like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's not.
I didn't know it was that common.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, in the universe as a whole, it's common. I mean,
within a single galaxy.
It's quite unusual. Yes. Yeah.
God, that's so cool.
Yeah. It really is. The quantum. Gravity waves. That's the other thing that absolutely blows my mind, that they can measure these. A gravity wave is when you get to ultra-massive objects, usually either black holes or neutron stars, circling each other. Basically, they're spiraling into each other. Their gravity is so great that they actually distort space and time, and it comes out as a wave. But by the time it gets to us, it's distorting our universe, our space by so little. It's less than an atom's width over a kilometer or so. And this is where they have these. And I'm not sure the details, but you have two lasers at 90 degrees to each other, and a mirror at this end, so that it goes up and down, and you can actually measure the gravitational wave as it influences. But it is so tiny that. Basically, it has to be buried in incredibly solid rock.
Oh, I've heard about this. Very deep. Yes, very deep into the ground.
Trucks don't influence it, or you have to rule out earthquakes. You have to rule out all sorts of stuff. Yes, but and it's basically the two lights, the lasers. The light should come back at exactly the same time because they're going exactly the same distance, and when the gravitational wave has gone through, they're just slightly off, and it's half a wavelength of light or something. It's really a minuscule amount, and then you confirm it with the second one. There's one in Washington State, which I would have thought Washington State was, with earthquakes and everything, that's a place where you get quite a lot of it.
Yeah, a lot of disruption.
But I believe one is up in Washington State, or maybe it's Idaho, I don't know. And then the other one's down in Oklahoma or somewhere like that. And I think there are some more around the world. But these are incredibly precise instruments. And the universe can be shaken like that. And time, it's not just physics, it's just not the space between, it's time is being influenced by that as well.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
All the more evidence that we shouldn't trust time.
Time is as several people said, time is an illusion, and maybe it is. I mean, color is an illusion.
Yeah.
The only place that color exists is in my brain.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there isn't. There's a, for those who can't
light
see
waves reflecting.
There's a TV up there with green on it. I'm not saying there isn't a wavelength of light coming out.
Right.
But it's not green.
Yeah.
It's a particular wavelength of light.
Right.
It's my brain that makes it green.
Yeah.
It's same with time. It may be with time. Time is more complicated, but Einstein has certainly led us to believe that maybe time is not primary in the universe. Which is, as I say, we sort of had this conversation about time, and it gets incredibly complicated.
Very quickly.
Yes, very, very quickly.
Is there anything else about these three questions?
Which we've left entirely behind.
For the first time ever, when we're describing God as the creator of heaven and earth, is there anything else useful that we should describe?
I actually just would like to come back to the second, the question 43, because we have talked so much about science, or at least I have.
Yeah.
The whole premise of science is that the universe is predictable. That if I drop a weight here on Earth, if I know the mass of the weight and I know the mass of the Earth, I can predict exactly how fast that weight will fall. If I go to the moon, I can predict exactly how fast it will fall. It will be slower than it will on Earth, but I can still predict it. If I go to the other end of the galaxy, of the universe, one of the principles of science is that on a planet over there, I can still make exactly the same predictions.
Yeah.
And the argument where science originally came from is that, of course you can. God created this universe. Yeah. He would create it with consistent laws across it. All of science is based on this assumption that the laws of physics are consistent, that because there is something holding them in place. There's no obvious reason why gravity should always be the same or follow the same rules everywhere. Yeah. I mean, there's even suggestions that there may be antimatter galaxies out there, which is another conversation. But the point is that the laws of physics still apply. That we can predict what would happen in an antimatter universe just as well as we can what would happen in a matter universe, because we can predict the laws because God created those laws, and that's so that I think is part of it. My understanding of creation in part is driven that it's divinely authored, if you like.
Yeah.
It is of God. When we look at the universe, we are looking at God's handiwork.
Yeah.
And we can learn about God from it. Not as much as we can from Scripture. And certainly there are details we cannot learn from the universe that we can learn from Scripture. I mean, the classic one is the Trinity.
Yeah.
But we can, as Romans argues, we can look at the universe and go,
it's plain.
God exists. It's absolutely clear. It doesn't mean the God of the Bible exists, but it does mean there has to be something that exists.
For some reason, when you made that statement, the thing that came to mind for me is, again, on this most recent read through the Gospels, the time when Jesus gets the most angry at people is when they ask him one question: are you willing that I should be healed?
Yes.
I mean, in some passages, he gets just downright angry with people. And his response is always, of course I'm willing.
Yes.
As if as if it's not plainly obvious all around you,
yes.
if you've seen me for one moment.
And coming back, I think that's a misunderstanding, because they had, first century Jews and Gentiles lived in this polytheistic world. Where, I mean, even Jews understood that there might be other. They denied them, but they understood the rest of the world thought there was Zeus and Jupiter and all these other. And you're right; they're upset with you most of the time. They seem to be. You're sacrificing stuff for them to try and keep them happy.
Right.
This is not the sort of God that goes around healing you.
Yeah.
This is the kind of God that if you're lucky, he isn't going to give you gangrene in the next cut that you get.
Yeah.
This is. Yes, this is a concept of God being good that was alien to the first century, and I think in some ways is alien to us today, because we understand that if I get gangrene, there's a reason for it. It's not that God's punishing me; it's that something biological has gone wrong. But God isn't healing me. We still deny that. Well, we still have this view of the world in a grand sense being against me, and I have to do something to placate it. Nowadays, it's pay home insurance premiums. But I'm sacrificing to the god of Prudential or whatever, and not to Zeus. But it's the same. Philosophically, the same idea.
And what I find so beautiful in that whole principle is, if we're describing a universe that's consistent. It means we're describing a God who's consistent, which means in the same way that we can test the reliability of our information about the universe, so we can do the same with God.
Yes.
Which I just think is the great takeaway out of this conversation, is the spiritual world is just as predictable as the physical world is. God's just waiting for us to pull out the test tubes and get to work.
Exactly, and don't build any temples up to heaven, because it won't be pretty when he's finished.
Read Genesis 11 for more commentary on this. Well, thank you, my brother, for taking this time.
Thanks.
And thanks you guys for taking the time to watch and listen to the podcast today. If you want to learn a little bit more about the God that David and I are talking about, or about this pretty interesting community of people that worship him, we're Good Samaritan.
God, that is not me.
Yeah, right. Worship God. Not David.
Please don't worship me. You can just ask my wife. Don't worship me.
Reference Genesis 11 again if you want to see how things go when that happens. Or I guess it's maybe 10. Table of Nations is chapter 11. The point is that we gather together on a regular basis to worship God. We meet on Sundays at 9:30 a.m. We also gather throughout the week for studying the scriptures, and you're welcome to join us. If you are really a Jesus freak, or if you think all this stuff is silly, or you're somewhere in between there, you're welcome to join us and meet this God, because he wants to meet you.
And we won't be offended by any questions.
No.
Any questions.
God, any questions.
Yeah.
Some of the best are just the questions. Yeah. It's actually the lack of questions that bothers me more than anything else.
Yeah, somebody's turned their brain off at that
point. I'm not going to make any more commentary about American Christianity. All right, God bless you guys. I hope to see you soon.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn this off briefly.